everybody to the podcast. So happy to have everyone on. I have a great guest with me today. Michael is with me. Michael is here to share his trilogy and more. And I'm excited to have Michael on the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Thank you, Dave. It's good to be here.
Excellent. So you have an interesting background, which I love, coming from a legal background and then making the big leap into writing books. Interested to kind of hear a little bit about your backstory that we can share with everybody, and kind of we'll parlay that into your writing career.
Sure. So I've been a practicing trial attorney for 36 years, although recently retired mostly. I'm in recovery, trying to figure out how to go to the next step. And your comment earlier about the transition is kind of interesting, because some people would allege that in the brief writing that I've been doing for the last 3 decades, I've been writing a lot of fiction in there as well. So not much of a leap maybe to go from being a trial attorney to a novelist.
So, okay, so with all the different legal avenues you could go down as a career, why did you choose what you had chosen for yourself?
That's a great question. I don't know that I've examined that thoroughly, but I think I was always attracted to the significance of trial proceedings, the fact that it's a stage, in large part in which each person is playing, a separate role, and the idea that without that avenue, and it'd be hard to find a place to tell a client's story. So a courtroom and trial work provides that opportunity for the client to get their story out there and for me to be their voice.
There's I can't imagine there's a lot of emotions doing like real estate law in comparison to what you were doing, but the courtroom seems to be a very emotional place as well for you as in your role, but for your clients, for the people gathered there as well. Like, you're dealing on a different level than just facts and situations, right? There's an emotional side to what you've done as well.
There really is an emotional side, and most of that comes from the individual clients that have found themselves, in this system. I did not do criminal law as a rule, so I didn't have clients whose freedom was at stake if I did a poor job or, if the jury returned a verdict against them. But a lot of the situations I dealt with were tragic and calamitous. I can remember cases in which we represented people that had been severely injured. Some people had died. Some people had lost their homes. Some people had lost their families. And so part of what a trial lawyer has to do is to channel that emotion, but try not to become affected by it in such a way that you lose your objectivity and you lose your ability to convey the story to either the judge or the jury.
Okay, so that's interesting. So, because I'm seeing a parallel with your writing career now as well, as we talked about this, is there's some things that kind of seem to carry over to writing. So, how much preparation time? I just imagining you're going to have multiple cases at the same time. Is that correct?
Yes, my docket was relatively small, and I probably handled 30 to 40 cases at a time, not all of which, of course, were going to go to trial. So there's a lot of conflicting demands on your time, but when you realize that a case is going to trial, which you'll often know, several weeks in advance, you basically put everything else aside and focus on that. I mean, life goes on around you, but we used to call it trial mode, and trial mode, I imagine, is somewhat similar to preparing for battle. You're checking that all your resources are available. You're checking that all the other important things in your life are being taken care of by other people. You're marshaling your evidence. You're organizing. You're preparing your witnesses. You're preparing your legal briefs. It's a pretty intense effort.
So in that process, as you what I'm anticipating is they don't teach you everything in law school that you're going to need to be successful. Organizational skills, like there's another whole soft side, I guess, to being a lawyer that you'd have to develop or have already before you come to the role. What kind of things did you have to kind of learn after law school that helped you to become a better lawyer?
Well, I think your education as a lawyer begins with law school. It doesn't end when you graduate. And so every day, every new client, every new legal dilemma that you encounter is another educational process and an opportunity to hone your skills. So the things that I had to learn a better form of time management, because when you're in law school, it's law school and there's not room for much else. But once you're out there in the real world, there are lots of things besides just handling cases that are part of the practice of law. You have to communicate with the people you work with. You have to, manage your practice, a lot of other things. So time management was a big one. Another one was how to synthesize a huge volume of information into a cogent story. It's a little more difficult than separating the wheat from the chaff because there's a lot of important stuff, and because of the way the rules work in lawsuits especially, you can't leave out things that might seem at first blush to be minuscule because they're important in getting things into evidence, into setting proper foundation for witnesses to testify. So it's a pretty arduous process. I was fortunate because, to me, it takes a great amount of patience to handle litigation. Your cases often stretch out for years. I've had cases that last 7 or 8 years. I've had very few that went to trial in less than 2 years. And I had developed some level of patience because I was a long-distance runner. And so that served me fairly well in terms of having the endurance and the ability to see that despite setbacks along the way, there was a finish line in sight. You just had to keep fixed on that.
Again, let's see. I'm hearing many parallels between your career in law and writing. I'm hearing patience. I'm hearing organization. I'm hearing taking all this massive information and putting it into something can be translated, right? I'm hearing about all the details that you need to encompass. There's a lot of author speak going on in the background as you're talking. I think a lot of authors could identify with as well.
Well, probably so. I mean, there are different types of books that people write, and fiction. The one thing that fiction gives me an opportunity to do that litigation did not is to be creative. Litigation is almost by definition a stifler of creativity because you've got to stick to the facts, and you can't really put on a case by having your decision maker imagine what happened or taking them to the scene but not giving them details, because ultimately the decision is made based on evidence. So that's a very freeing aspect of being a novelist that I wasn't able to enjoy very much while I practiced law.
So this whole thing. So let's kind of let's build a bridge for our listeners about what you learned in your law practice that you could relate to writing your book, and how that kind of sets you up to be more successful based on what you've learned in law, and how you can apply that to becoming an author. What's that bridge? What does it look like?
Well, it's hard to pinpoint every parallel or every experience that has enabled me to write and in some cases write successfully. I would say that discipline was obviously a huge factor, because you're not going to be a successful trial attorney if you're not disciplined. And that translated well in terms of understanding that a book doesn't get finished unless you put your butt in the chair day after day after day and soldier on to the very end. And it's not always an easy journey. There certainly are places where you get bogged down while you're writing a book. The same is true, I think, of litigation. Another thing that helped me well, and this goes back actually before even my legal training, I was a journalism major in college and always loved to write, and I wrote newspaper stories and magazine articles for a while. And what that teaches you, as well as in the legal arena, is to try to be precise and concise with words, to try to pack a lot of meaning into simple declarations. Unlike this podcast, when you're in court, you don't get to talk all you want. You have to. You got an opposing counsel who's raising objections. You've got a judge who's yawning. Sometimes you have jurors that are nodding off, and so you have to shift a little bit and pack as much meaning as you can into a few words. And I think that's served me well in being a novelist.
There's we talked in our pre-interview together. We had a great conversation around you mentioned somebody who's a painter, and they were painting landscape paintings, and your kind of your thoughts around how you would paint a landscape painting versus how they would paint it. And it was kind of interesting. We want to just kind of touch on that again, because it helped you, in effect, paint a picture of that creative process. And we want to kind of talk about that for a sec.
Sure. So this came about because as I was writing my first book, Ultimate Verdict, I kept stumbling around trying to make the first chapter perfect before moving on to the second chapter. And then when I would change something in the second chapter, I would go back to the first chapter. And part of this is an innate perfectionism that I have that served me fairly well in the legal profession, but it became a real stumbling block in writing a novel. And at a moment of reflection, I started thinking that, well, I'm not doing this the right way. I'm doing something incorrect in terms of what my process should be. So I reached out to a friend of mine who is a landscape painter, and I told her about the trouble I was having getting past the second or third chapter. And she said, well, here's what I do. When I paint, I obviously am looking at the entire scene, but I don't start in the upper left-hand corner of my canvas and go across and then down until I finish in the lower right-hand corner. I do a technique called layering. And of course, when she said that, I'm like, oh, of course, Mike, you're an idiot. You should have seen this. You can't. It's unlike reading a book. Writing a book is not like reading a book. You don't go from, chapter 1 all the way through the end without stopping. What you do is you put it all down, and what I would describe that in terms of a landscape portrait is you have the shadows, you have the bones, you have kind of the bare essence of what you're going to do. And then when you're done with that part of it, you go back and you start adding important details like color and shading, and maybe even changing a little bit the way the sunlight shines on a particular part of your portrait, maybe highlighting certain aspects of it that you hadn't intended to highlight when you first started. And so my painter friend described all this to me, and it really helped to formulate my thinking. And I don't really like the word template, because I don't think that we write the same way every time we sit down, but it gave me a format, if you will, for how to get through the first book, and then to go back and layer in nuance and color and smell and tension and context and all sorts of other things that I think make for a really good story.
And again, you've painted a very good picture for us. I love this. Tell me a little bit about writing a trilogy. Do you go into writing a trilogy knowing you're going to write a trilogy, or are you writing one book at a time that just sort of feed each other?
I think there are some authors who probably do go in thinking they're going to write a trilogy, and those folks have a better grasp of where they're going to wind up than I did. In my case, I thought Ultimate Verdict was going to be a standalone novel. And as I started developing the characters and the conflict and the issues that they were facing as they go through the story, I realized that it couldn't all be done in one book. And part of that is because typically in my writing, I try for depth rather than breadth. So I'm not really seeking to cover the waterfront of a topic. I'm not necessarily seeking to cover a topic at all. What I'm doing is creating characters who come alive and they get very complex. And as they get complex, I want to go deeper. I want to understand what motivates them. I want to understand what's happening that leads to certain periods of euphoria and what happens that leads them down into the depths of a temporary depression. I want to know all of that. So as I began layering all these things in and what I thought, was a very interesting development of a complex character who in this case is a judge, I realized about 2/3 of the way through that first book that it wasn't just one book, that there needed to be a second book. And then I had to develop a way to transition between the first book and the second book and end book one at a place that intrigued readers enough to try to read book two.
Yeah.
Same thing kind of happened when I got to the end of book two. I was like, well, I've introduced a new character who she is an attorney and a former prosecutor who was bent on finding the man who murdered her sister. And as she began to develop some complexities and some conflicts, I realized that we couldn't finish her in book two either. So then we came up with book three, and that was the method by which I wound up going from what I thought was a standalone story to a trilogy.
So, is book three the end of the trilogy then? And there's other things coming down the road, but is that trilogy complete then in your mind? Are you happy with it?
I am happy with it. There is an ultimate resolution in book three that ties in all the loose ends except for one, and that one loose end has grown into a fourth novel, which I just published earlier this month, that's called Ella's Wings. And it is about a woman who is traumatically injured and mentally damaged in a bombing, which occurs at the end of the second book of the trilogy. So that loose thread kept calling me to explore and write more about, and that's ultimately how Ella's Wings came about.
Let's see. I love hearing all that. As you're writing, Mike, and as you're writing and you're kind of creating this world, are there times where you just smile? You're like, oh, that's so satisfying that I've kind of gone down this path with this character and I've been able to develop them and I'm seeing them grow in front of me. And I get to write this next line, which just makes me happy. Did you have some of those experiences as you're writing?
I had a lot of those experiences, Dave. I mean, it's a real joy to be able to sit down and write like I do. My wife has sometimes said, well, you've returned to childhood. We all spent time with imaginary friends and making up games and all that. Now you get to do it full time if you want to, and maybe even make a little money at it. So there's a real pleasure in doing it. I often get more pleasure when I go back and read a book that I've already published and I see something that I hadn't seen before, some connection that I've made from one point in the story to the other that I really didn't know that I had made, or some subtle revelation about someone's character that I had forgotten about that just kind of comes out. So yeah, there's a lot of smiling when I'm writing. There's some frowning too, when you kind of write yourself into a corner, as they say. But
yeah,
there's a lot of smiling. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I love, and the fact that somebody is going to uncover this plot twist or this character or this development, just knowing that that's going to come later in the book, and you're like, I can't wait for you to get to chapter 4, because when you get to 4, you're going to find out something, and you're like, I know what you're going to find out, and it must be rewarding for you as an author to kind of bake that into the story as well.
Yeah, that's the plant. So it's a well-known suspense technique where you place little seemingly innocuous and perhaps irrelevant details in a book early on in order to reveal them later, and that helps the reader tie it all together. Because I'm not a writer who spoon feeds the reader. I don't particularly like that style. I don't really like that style as a reader. I don't want to be told every detail, and I don't want it to be a procedural which predictably proceeds from one chapter to the next. I want there to be surprises, and those plants help you to bring that out at the end, and sort of in the big reveal. So that's a lot of fun. I will say that it's more difficult than it might seem, because oftentimes you finish and you realize that you placed a plant somewhere and then you never used it. Mm-hmm. Or you get to the climax and you realize that the climax requires certain information that you failed to include earlier in the book, and that's what revision is all about.
Yeah. Okay, so the one thing I kind of hear when I talk to like police officers that watch a movie about police, or lawyers that watch a crime show on television or read a book about crime, is there's points in the story where somebody in the profession be like, that would never happen. That's not how that works. That's not correct. Is there, as you kind of create this, how deep do you go into the legal side of the story without getting to the point where somebody like myself without a legal background might get bogged down in detail? How deep do you go to keep it relevant and the information correct without getting somebody stuck on something that they may not have knowledge about? How do you kind of balance that?
Well, it is a balancing act. I think what I tend to do is I tend to write certain scenes, courtroom scenes especially, in a highly technical fashion. Because of my background, I know that in certain cases there are 9 or 10 steps that must be completed before you get, for example, a piece of evidence in. And then what I do in the revision process is I try to gauge how is a non-lawyer going to view this. Are they going to get bogged down in detail? Is this going to be boring? Are they going to, I hate to say it, stop reading because they've gotten bogged down in detail? And if I believe that that's possible, I'll usually trim it back. I'm also very fortunate to have a very good developmental editor whom I've used on the last 3 books, and she is great about giving me the editor's equivalent of the yawn when I've gone too deeply and I'm boring the reader, and it's time to pull back and rewrite that section. But it's not always easy to know. And one thing that I've learned is you can't write for everyone. You can't write for someone who has been in the courtroom dozens of times and understands all the nuances of legal procedure, and at the same time write for someone who has never been in a courtroom but wants to experience that through words. You're not going to be able to make everybody happy, so you have to be your own filter. And sometimes I use beta readers, but I found with beta readers that the process of creativity gets kind of bogged down going from here's a draft that I think's pretty good to waiting for your beta reader comments, which often can take months to arrive, and so you lose a little bit of momentum, you lose a little bit of zest for the process, and when that enthusiasm starts to wane in the person who's creating the story, it's a bad sign. It's difficult to re-energize, if you will. So I don't use beta readers that much, and so I guess there are times when things that I publish could potentially have benefited from beta readers, but I've simply chosen not to wait that long to get through the process.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, because I've had authors on that swear by their beta readers, but it's nice to kind of hear the other side of that as well, because I can really anticipate that would be quite an interesting journey as an author, to be waiting for this feedback, and it's like these people are reading this for the first time, and they're not seeing what you're seeing as an author, and they'll be like, well, I don't really understand, and you're like, well, you will, but you just gotta kind of work with what you have. So that's interesting. The other thing too is, I noticed we chatted before too, writing a book is in a sense like creating your own business. So in your mind, how are they similar and how are they different in writing a book and, starting something like this? Because you are, in a sense, with the very first book, you are creating your own small business in a way.
Yeah, there are certainly some parallels. I would say that for me, I think I'm pretty good at envisioning the product and building that product. What I'm really bad at is merchandising that product. Like a lot of writers, I just don't have a taste for it. I don't really like it. I don't like spending time on marketing and advertising because I want to create things. So for me, if I were to be a better businessman, that's really the flaw in my plan, is that I don't do a very good job of promoting the book, telling people about it, getting the word out there, because I do want people to read it. But I also don't really write for other people. I write for myself. I think I'm my own worst critic, and when I'm happy with it, it goes out. My wife is fond of saying that, I will sometimes get paralysis by analysis, or my perfectionist tendencies prevent me from publishing. And I kind of chastise her for being so alliterative, but nevertheless, she's right. She's right about that. And it's a hard thing to do. What you find, if just to use the business world as an example, what I find is that there are very few people out there in the business world who can create and plan and execute. Usually, they're good at one or two of those, but they need a team in order to help them get through all of that. And the author's slog is notoriously very individual and isolated. And I guess maybe the more successful commercial authors probably do have teams of people to help them with the marketing, but I have not arrived at that point, and I'm not sure that I ever will.
So from your advice, from your point of view, for somebody that is struggling with promoting a book, then maybe what would you suggest to an author listening? What has worked for you then? What are some of the things that are easier, maybe, that require less effort, that are effective?
Yeah, so that's the magical question. And I've been to a number of writing conferences, and I've spoken to a number of authors and traditional publishers and things like that. And the answer is, and I'm not trying to be glib about it, but the answer really is that no one knows. No one knows exactly what takes an obscure but good book into something that's well known. I mean, you certainly can build a machine like certain authors have done, and focus heavily on marketing, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I'll give you an example. The biggest sales period in the history of my books, which have been out there I think now since 2018, was in the fall after the winter release of my first book, and my efforts to publicize the book and market it during that time were essentially zero. So word of mouth is a possibility, but I can't pinpoint any particular thing that I did or didn't do which caused sales to take off. They just did.
It's interesting. Yeah. Because that's the one thing I hear a lot of authors that do come on, they do struggle in this area. And it is something like we talk about, like you may love writing, you may love the creative process, but at the end of the day, you have a book on your table, a box of them, and now you need to sell these things. And some people, that's where they trip up, is that's when you finish the book and it's all done, that's not the finish line. In some cases, that's the starting line, where now you need to get out there and get it in front of potential readers. So any tips like that do help for sure.
Well, I'm speaking as much to myself as to your audience. I would say that an important aspect of going from writing a good book to being able to sell that good book is an adjustment in attitude. I haven't done a good job of adjusting my attitude to think of the writing as a business. It's certainly important to write a good book, and craft is critical if you want to be happy with what you're writing. There are certainly authors out there whose craft is not all that solid, but their marketing and their publicity efforts are fantastic, and they sell lots of mediocre books. I think it's a little harder for somebody who's fixated, if you will, on craft to adjust to the idea of figuring out how to market a book. But if you want people to read it the way that I've done it, which is relying on word of mouth and a pretty good dose of luck, is not the blueprint. It's not the way to do it. So part of what we're doing here, having this conversation, is to get me out of my writer's shell and a little bit more into my merchandising shell, and say, okay, let's give this a try and see if I like it and if I can understand how this process works a little better.
So on that, how is the process so far? How are you enjoying this?
I think we're having a great chat, Dave. I really do. And I think if you look at it in a way that's about, talking about craft and the process and things of that nature, it's much more enjoyable than I thought it would be.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about all the books. I'd love to name them all so everyone can do this. We do have show notes, so there'll be clickable links for anyone listening to go and purchase the books. But at a high level, can you just kind of touch on the trilogy and then the new book as well?
Sure. So the trilogy is what I call the ultimate trilogy because it consists of 3 titles: Ultimate Verdict, Ultimate Deception, and the final one is Ultimate Truth. And to give the elevator pitch, it's a story about a federal judge who toils for a good part of his life in a system that he recognizes as broken. And there's a particularly tragic, triggering event that causes him to set up a secret courtroom in a tractor trailer and go on the road and capture criminals and try them in secret.
Wow.
The book, on a much deeper level, that has some appeal from a visual perspective, but on a much deeper level, this judge is he's part Native American, part Cherokee, and he has this deep sense of place living here in the mountains of western North Carolina. He's also been raised as a Catholic. So most of the conflicts that we see are internal, and him trying to balance and understand if what he's doing is truly wrong on all fronts or if it's only wrong on some fronts, and how he justifies the actions that he's taking. Because he's vowed over the decades that he's been a practicing lawyer to follow the law and to uphold the Constitution, and yet what he's doing barely pays lip service to those things.
That's amazing. I love the visual of this tractor trailer courtroom. This feels like a movie at some point too, Mike. I love how you've created this landscape painting for us, as we alluded to, and you kind of create that for us. That's quite unique.
Fun. It's a lot of fun. Took a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. And I don't think I'm done with the judge yet. His name is Raleigh Westlake, and I can envision a sequel to the trilogy, if you will, down the road in which some of these topics are explored in even more depth.
One thing we talked about earlier on too is you had some great advice when the question came up about how to write a book, and there was a product suggestion made to you to motivate you to stay in your seat and write. Do you remember what that suggestion was?
I do. So I went to a writing seminar a number of years ago. It's probably been 10, 12 years back, and there was an author there from Charleston, and somebody asked her, what's the best advice that you could give to a writer? And she said, butt glue. And when she said it, nobody really understood exactly. I don't know if it's because we heard the words in a garbled sense, and somebody said, well, I don't understand. What is that? She goes, buy yourself a figurative tub of glue and glue your butt to the seat and write. And she elaborated on that by saying that when she sees people who are failing to complete their books, it's almost always because they don't spend enough time in the chair. They get distracted. Life's other responsibilities get in the way. They get writer's block and think that they'll never be able to do it. So that's a wise piece of advice that I have stuck with in times of trouble. It's amazing how many times when you sit down and in front of a computer, because I write on a laptop, and you get this blank stare like, I have no idea what to write next. If you give yourself just a few moments, remain undistracted, it comes. You know, the characters might speak to you. You might envision a scene. And what she said is write anything. The only thing she said that you shouldn't do is write like Jack Nicholson did in The Shining, where you sit down for days and write thousands of pages of murder. She said that sends you into a bad place. So other than that, she said anything is fair game.
Nice. So, Mike, as we close up today, again, we'll have links to all the books in the show notes. For the person that's looking on your website or online to purchase one of your books, they're ready to click buy now, and they're not sure if this book is going to be for them. We have the author with us right now. What would you say to a person who's contemplating purchasing the trilogy? What would you like to say to them? Why would this trilogy speak to them?
Well, I think for people who are interested in suspense and who are interested at all in consequential courtroom drama, and especially if somebody's looking for a little deeper plunge into the psychological aspects of the legal system and lawyers and even victims, because as much as anything, the book is about victims. The trilogy is about victims. That it's a good book to read. It's easy to read, but it's also thought-provoking in some ways. And for those who maybe aren't that enamored with courtroom drama, the fourth book that I just released, Ella's Wings, is all told. The story is all told from the perspective of a victim, And it's not all doom and gloom. There obviously is some part of that, but what Ella has to do is emerge from a devastating situation to regain some portion of her life. And I think that might appeal to the same people that read the legal thrillers, but it might appeal to a different audience as well. So they're pretty easy reads, I've been told. They're page turners. You can get through them, and some, if not all, of the characters are actually likable.
Is there any Mike hiding between the covers here at all? Are we going to trip over your character? Do you show up?
Well, no, not
Okay.
specifically, but
All right.
the characters are all an amalgam of our experiences and personality traits. So there's some of me in there in various places, certainly in the lawyer aspect of it. But no, I'm not putting myself out there. I'm not doing a cameo like Alfred Hitchcock used to do in his movies.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's great, Mike. So what is the best way for people to connect with you here? The people that have been listening to our podcast to this point, they're in. They want to interact with you. How do we contact you and get in touch?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to do that. Probably the easiest way is to go to my website, which is michaelwinstead.com, and you can leave a note there, or and I invite you to contact me directly through my email, which is michael.winstead, that's WINSTEAD .author@gmail.com. I love to hear from readers, even when the comments are not always kind, and I usually try to reply to them when I can.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael, so much for your time. Thank you for making time for us. And looking forward to book number 5 in the future.
Number 5's in the works.
I love it.
It is.
It's
It's another legal thriller about the nefarious land grab by a foreign entity in the southeastern United States.
Ooh. Do you have a timeline at all for this?
I do. Timeline's probably next spring.
Okay.
This one's going to have a little bit more connection to current events, and so we're going to try to do a little pre-publication publicity and generate some interest, because although it is pure fiction, there are some factual bases for what I'm writing, and so there's that tie-in, and we kind of want to get the word out a little bit before, but probably in the spring is when it'll come out.
So you have an open door to come back. I'd love to have you back, Mike. If you find value in podcasting to promote your books, you can come back as often as you want, because I see there's going to be many books in the future for you.
Well, Dave, I appreciate it. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Please go check out all the links in the show notes. And you're looking for it. My wife is going to be all over this, Mike. So you're going to see a purchase for sure from Canada. So excited to have you on. Thank you for taking time.
Well, thanks for all the viewers watching. It's been a real interesting ride.
Excellent. Very good. Hi, guys. This is Dave from Living the Next Chapter, a podcast designed to connect authors and audiences. We're always on the lookout for our next interview. If you're an author, a publisher, and you have a book, whether you're just starting, whether you're halfway through writing, or it's all done and you want to tell the world, that's why we're here at Living the Next Chapter. Get in touch with us through livingthenextchapter.com, contact us, and let's set up some time together to discuss your book, to discuss your project, and how we can get you on the show. My name is Dave, and I would love to speak to you. So go to livingthenextchapter.com, and let's get over there together and discuss all the great things that you're up to as an author, as a publisher, and let's grow your audience together. Join us on livingthenextchapter.com for great authors and an audience that's eager to hear about what you're up to as an author and a publisher. Contact us today, and let's get your book out in front of others. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.